Okay, so there are still some people coming in, but I'll start now. So thank you for joining us today. So we're thrilled to be able to welcome you to Responsible Disruption and our Innovation Table Zoomcast. My name is James Gamage, and I'm the Director of Innovation in the Social Impact Lab at the United Way of Calgary and area.
And my name is Monique Blau, and I'm Director of Strategy and Design in the lab and at J5 Design, a Calgary-based innovation and design firm. And we are the hosts of Responsible Disruption. We're excited to welcome our guests and our viewers as we explore this important topic, the impact of social isolation. But before we begin, in the spirit of our journey to promote reconciliation, I would like to honor the truth of a shared history and acknowledge Treaty 7 territory and the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Kainai, Siksika, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Wesley First Nations. I would also like to recognize the Métis people and the Inuit people who have made their home here in Mohkinstsis, also known as Calgary. We stand against racism and intolerance in any form. We believe everyone deserves to live in equitable communities that are built on inclusion, diversity, understanding, and tolerance. At the Social Impact Lab, we strive to put people first, to create a diverse and inclusive culture where everyone feels safe and valued. We have a few housekeeping items to cover, and of course, our agenda. So first of all, we are recording this session. So if you want to share it with your colleagues or friends, we will email you a follow-up link in the next couple of days. The recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. Our next Responsible Disruption Zoomcast will be on June 16th at 2 p.m., where we will be discussing social entrepreneurs in the making. That should be also an exciting topic. Our agenda for today will include introductions of our wonderful guests, an engaging conversation with them, audience questions, and our close. If you'd like to ask a question along the way, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A button on the Zoom panel, which is often found at the bottom of your screen, or sometimes on one of the sides, depending on the devices you're using. We'll be collecting these questions throughout our entire session, and we'll answer as many as we can. This is also audience engagement, so please ask questions. The Social Impact Lab is a collaboration between J5 Design and United Way of Calgary and area. It is our response to the disruption that we're seeing in the social sector. And at the lab, we invest in innovation, which we are calling responsible disruption, ensuring that any change that results is considered and fair to Calgarians and communities. Our Responsible Zoomcasts are a series of discussions with leading players about disruption in their fields. And today's episode, the impact of social isolation. An elderly person sits alone in front of the television day after day. A newcomer to Canada, having to navigate a life exclusively through phone calls or generic web pages. A queer youth living in a small town, dispirited by another barrier between them and belonging. What do all these people have in common? Social isolation and loneliness. Social isolation is defined as an objective lack of social relationships or infrequency of social contact, while loneliness is a subjective feeling of isolation, both having negative consequences for mental health. 1 in 5 Albertans suffer from mental health concerns. Since March 2020, we all know we've been living an unnaturally isolated lifestyle due to socially distancing measures, which have been put in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And while social isolation has been an effective method for keeping the virus under control, it has had its own destructive side effects, including social isolation and loneliness. Any pandemic, war, or other massive cultural disruptor tends to magnify and accelerate previously unexplored cracks in society. And this pandemic has revealed an epidemic of loneliness that had already been growing in Western culture and has become increasingly harmful. I'm sure we know people that are today dealing with their own version of social isolation and loneliness. Today, we have invited 3 experts from our local community to join this conversation and to speak from 3 very different perspectives: academic, feet on the ground, and lived experience. Together, they will guide us through a journey to understand the what, why, and how we combat of this important and previously relevant topic. Social isolation is only one piece of the equation, though. Loneliness is the killer. And though one generally follows the other, some people who are socially isolated don't always feel lonely, and therefore do not always feel the negative side effects associated to social isolation. On the other hand, some very special people have trouble connecting on a deeper level with other people, and therefore do not experience social isolation, but experience the negative effects, which are loneliness. For today's episode, we would ask that you reframe what you were thinking about social isolation to also include loneliness as a variable.
Okay, so let's meet this week's guests. So first off, we have our first guest is Dr. Alex Bierman. So Alex is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Calgary. His research is centered on the study of aging and health, but encompasses a number of additional topics, including social psychology, religion, military sociology, and the family. This research is united by an interest in how social inequality conditions exposure to stress and the consequences of stress as individuals age. Alex's research has been published in a number of prominent journals, and he co-edited the second edition of the Handbook of Sociology of Mental Health, which has over 450,000 chapter downloads worldwide. Beginning in 2022, Alex will be the co-editor of the journal Society and Mental Health, which is sponsored by the American Sociological Association's section on the sociology of mental health. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
Our next guest is Matteo Vitali. Matteo was born and raised in Latakia, Syria. When he was 11 years old, the civil war started. After 5 years, his family was able to leave the country and refuge to Canada. They arrived in February 2016, and he joined the Calgary Bridge Foundation for Youth Mentorship program on his second day of school. Since then, he has volunteered for CBFY during the summers of 2016 and 2017 as a peer mentor in the summer program. Matteo joined the CBFY Board of Directors to represent the youth, learn from the experiences of other members, to give back to the community and try to make a positive change. After his term ended, he worked with the City of Calgary as a recreational leader in programs for refugee children while completing an honours psychology degree at the University of Calgary. He is now working on a research team that investigates Indigenous experiences with police, and he is starting his own strength-based research project to examine the resiliency of Syrian refugees in Canada. Welcome, Matteo. Finally, we have Monica Piros. Monica is the Director of Child and Family Services at the Stoney Nakoda Nation. Monica is native Calgarian and completed her graduate training in clinical social work at the University of Oklahoma in 2016. She holds ancillary degrees in chemical abuse counseling, criminology, and public service. She is a member of the International Center for Clinical Excellence and is passionate about destigmatizing mental health struggles and customizing treatment approaches using various modalities to ensure her clients receive effective and compassionate care. Monica works extensively with youth, families, couples, and individual adults experiencing anxiety, depression, and grief, and specializes in trauma brought on by family breakdown and violence, resettlement, and substance abuse. She is LGBTQ2S ally, an avid coffee drinker, a patron of the arts, and a voracious reader. Welcome, Monica, and welcome to you all. So, after that great introduction to you all, I'm just going to remind the audience of the importance of participation in these Zoom casts. It makes for a much better experience if we're asking the questions that the audience is asking. So please use the Q&A panel in your Zoom menu, whether that's on the bottom of the page or on the side, and ask questions in that. And Monique and myself will make sure that we pass them on to the panel. So please use that facility on the Zoom. But nevertheless, I will start with some questions to get things kicked off. And I'd like to start with you, Alex. So you've done lots of research on the impact of social isolation, particularly in the context of the pandemic. What have you found are the effects of social isolation and loneliness on cognitive function and mental health?
Well, we haven't really looked at cognitive function, but we've largely focused on mental health across a number of studies. And what we found was, first of all, we already had done a survey of Canadians in September of 2019, before the pandemic began. And then we took a second survey of Canadians in late March in 2020, right after the pandemic began. And what's really critical there was we found that people were already reporting much higher experiences of social isolation. Basically, the rate of social isolation over really a short period, you could already see it really increasing with subsequent mental health effects. People reporting, due to this social isolation, more symptoms of psychological distress, symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of depression. And what we found since that study is we continue to examine these two samples over time. And what we found is that the people's feelings of loneliness, and also not just people's feelings of loneliness, but the extent to which they feel like they have confidence on their lives. Both of these things have really decreased over the pandemic. And that's really made people feel as if they feel less healthy. People don't feel as healthy as they used to, in part because they don't feel as socially connected to each other. They do feel lonelier. They do feel as if they don't have people around that they can really talk to. And what's really interesting is, we haven't really published this part, but we've really examined people right up until February and April. We kept talking to people throughout the pandemic. What we found was that over last summer, people are starting to recover a little bit. And I think that's because they were going out, they were able to talk to people. And what we found was that that recovery receded. And as of December and February, people were feeling as about isolated as they did at the beginning of the pandemic and into the early days of the pandemic. So I haven't followed it right up until today, but what seems to happen was this pandemic was really wearing on people, and people were not really able through Zoom or email or Skype or telephone to really regain a sense of not feeling isolated. These increases that we saw in isolation continued through much of the pandemic with detrimental effects on mental health.
Yeah, I'm sure we can all relate to the wearing effect, and
Yeah,
you know, certainly I saw some figures recently that if anything, things are getting worse. So I can certainly relate to that. You mentioned people feeling less healthy.
Yeah.
Does that stretch to physical health as well as mental health?
Absolutely, because what we say to people, just overall, how healthy are you? Just tell us, is your health poor? Is it excellent? And that sounds like a very simple measure, but what we find is people actually have a pretty good sense of their overall state of health. Sure, they may not be able to diagnose themselves with different conditions. I mean, I'm sure we've all had that experience of going to the internet and looking up a condition on WebMD, and suddenly we diagnose ourselves with scurvy. But the point here is that even if we ignore the specific diagnoses, well, at the end of the day, you're subject to all these different little internal experiences. You experience these very subtle little gradations in your health that a doctor would never really be able to understand or attach to anything. So overall, you have a pretty good sense of what your overall physical well-being is. And what we find is that this measure, when we just say to people, what is your health? It actually relates to a lot of different things, a lot of doctor diagnosed conditions, and even mortality. So what we found was that people's sense of how healthy they were did decrease during this first several months of the pandemic. And what that really suggests is that people were really feeling less healthy. And a primary contributor to why this was because they were feeling more isolated and less in touch with others.
Good, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so Monica, when we think about social isolation and loneliness, I think it's important to understand that some groups are higher risk than others, and perhaps immigrants, perhaps older adults, perhaps those marginalized groups like LGBTQ2S, people of color, and indigenous groups. What are the challenges of these underserved communities, and how do you think we should address them specifically?
Well, it's been my honor and privilege to work with the Stony Nakoda community since last fall. And I came to my role there a couple months into the pandemic. Things were in full isolation. Many of the social programs in the community had been put on a hiatus or not offered at all due to the risk of community contamination. So in a place, in a rural setting and in a community where gatherings, customs, rituals, naming ceremonies, grieving ceremonies are integral to the cohesiveness of a small community or a distinct culture. And at a time when those things cannot take place, and if they do, they have the added unfortunate aspect of becoming, in some cases, super spreading events with relation to COVID. So it's almost like adding insult to injury in our Indigenous communities everywhere, especially around the city. Not only are people forced to not be able to gather and engage with one another in ways that are culturally important and culturally healing. In the event they do, they run the risk of making themselves and others sick as well. So this has been hugely difficult to deal with. We have a large number of children and youth in the care of the agency, and they've been impacted because many of the elders in the community have become ill or passed away from COVID and other circumstances with respect to general health. So even our caregivers, our elders in the community, people that are looked up to as leaders, have been so dramatically impacted by this pandemic. And when people can't connect with their different generations of their family, people feel more lost. It's been explained to me as a loss of spirit, and everything the healing traditions and ceremonies are meant to do is reunite people with that lost sense of themselves and spirit. And that gets harder to do as this wears on, and the focus has to be on public safety.
And yeah, I can fully understand that, particularly in societies that are very sort of ceremonial based, and that provides enormous support to the community. So do you think also that leads to people being stuck in silos, the isolation and perhaps the negative impacts of almost siloization of society?
Absolutely. I was thinking about this and having this conversation with one of my staff earlier today. Unlike in the city, you can't make a call or use an app to order dinner, to have your groceries dropped off if you don't feel safe or comfortable going to fetch them yourself. These kind of services that we're accustomed to in urban centers don't exist in rural areas and on the reserves around the city and all over our nation and elsewhere. So people really rely on the social services in the community. All of the directors that are my colleagues and frontline staff and other helping agencies have had to get really creative with how resources and necessities are delivered to people who are not able to leave their homes. And the Stony Nakoda Nation is an enormous reserve. People are spread out from Morley all the way out to Eden Valley and the MD of Bighorn. There are places in the community that I work for I haven't even been able to get out to and put boots on the ground because it's just so vast. So there are a lot of challenges with checking up on people. We have a digital divide. There are areas in the location that I work where internet service is sketchy at best. We have meetings sometimes we can't complete or that come offline when it's windy. We just lose our connection to the internet. So there's all these components that make service delivery more difficult and make it more difficult to be checking in on elders, on people who are not in good health, on the families where we know there are challenges with addiction or family violence. And this has made it extremely difficult for our health team, for our frontline child intervention team to be able to do their jobs and to manage risk and be on top of the community needs as they emerge. It's been remarkably challenging for everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, I saw a frightening stat today that potentially up to 200,000 kids have dropped out of the school system in the last year. Now, if you think the school system is one of the systems of care that exist out there, that you think that the extent of that is quite frightening. So thank you. So I'm just going to turn to you now, Matteo. So a couple of years ago, in the Social Impact Lab, we collaborated on designing a story-based simulation, which supports adults in becoming a natural support for youths in their lives. And Matteo here was a content consultant for a social isolation simulation story that we wrote, which involved a 13-year-old newcomer to Canada named Khalil. So the simulation, if you want to go and check it out, it's free, a free online tool. You can look at www.naturalsupportsyc.com, and you can check that out at any time. But Matteo, obviously that story was based on your own experience. Newcomers to Canada, specifically youths, are perhaps especially susceptible to social isolation. Would you be willing to share your own experience of social isolation coming to Canada from Syria in your early teens, and tell us why it's important that as a society we focus on helping to solve this problem?
Of course, like you were saying, James, certain members of society are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 crisis and social isolation. And I'd say refugees and refugee youth in particular are being disproportionately affected. Some of the specific vulnerabilities that refugee newcomers are facing include barriers to accessing healthcare services, disproportionate rates of mental health concerns, financial constraints, racism, higher likelihoods of living in relatively higher density and multi-generational dwellings. And from my own experience, it was really, really hard for me when I first came here to kind of worry about what a normal student would worry about, midterms and parties and making friends, when I had family in Syria that I had to worry about every single day because I don't know if they're going to be alive the next day, right? Because there were bombings and kidnaps and all those things happening in my country. So the COVID-19 crisis have definitely elevated those levels of stress that they already existed before COVID-19 for refugees and newcomers. And some of the research that I've been looking at that's actually being done in Ontario have listed some recommendations that we should try doing specifically for refugee newcomers after COVID-19. Some of them include like considering social determinants and social determinants of health in the new context of COVID-19 and providing services to a trauma-informed lens, and increasing focus on continuity of health and mental health care, and maybe even mobilizing international Medicare graduates for triaging patients based on COVID-19 symptoms, and diversifying communication efforts to educate refugees about COVID-19, because from my own experience, I can say that people from my country sometimes don't really know about the effects of COVID-19. I mean, I was talking to my uncle just last week, and he was telling me how he had to wake up at 5 a.m. to go get, bread from this bakery, and he waited for 10 hours to get bread. And he was telling me how, there were like hundreds of people waiting in line. And I was like, wow, that's insane. Were they at least wearing masks? And he started laughing. He's like, no one here wears masks. They don't even care about that because they haven't been informed. And, when you have such, I'd say more major issues and, safety concerns, you don't really have time to think about the effects of COVID-19 and, how it affects physical and mental health. So I think the biggest recommendation that I would have for how we should help out newcomers coming to Canada is just providing information about COVID-19, preferably from people from their own culture. people explain them in their own language and from their own culture so they would understand it a little bit more.
Thank you. You mentioned, actually, I saw in your bio about CBFY. From your own experience, how important was CBFY for you to help, settle and overcome social isolation when you first turned up in the country?
The Calgary Bridge Foundation for Youth has literally changed my life. I cannot stress enough the impact that it had on my personal well-being and my family as a whole. But my best friends right now are people who I've met while volunteering at the Calgary Bridge Foundation for Youth. My confidence, my public speaking skills, my leadership skills, all of those skills I've gained through programs offered by the Calgary Bridge Foundation for Youth. And when it comes to, social skills, even financially, I mean, I won a scholarship that was offered with the Calgary Bridge Foundation for Youth. So I cannot stress the importance of these organizations like the Calgary Bridge Foundation for Youth, like the Catholic Immigration Society, CCIS, like United Way as well. Those organizations are literally changing people's lives. So I just want to say thank you to all these organizations. And if there are any people who work in these organizations that are watching today, your work really matters. So please keep doing what you're doing.
That's a great shout out for them. Thoroughly deserved as well. You're interested in population resiliency as well, aren't you? And I'm just interested in the role you might think social connection could share with resiliency. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, socialization is absolutely critical for resiliency. I think the biggest factor that was found in research being done with veterans who are experiencing PTSD is that the more social and family connections they had and the stronger those connections were, the lesser symptoms of PTSD and the higher scores of resiliency that they had. And, I think that applies to other populations as well. And this is what the research that I'm doing right now is focusing on, trying to see if those results would also apply to refugee populations and newcomer populations. I think socialization and social connections is one of the biggest factors that will influence resiliency for sure.
Cool. Thank you.
I think that's interesting. Earlier, Matteo, Dr. Bierman and I were speaking, and it was just before we jumped in, but this idea of social capital. And as we're talking about population resiliency, it makes me think of social capital. And maybe Dr. Bierman, you could chime in on some of what Matteo has shared and share a little bit about also social capital means in the context of loneliness and the pandemic and social isolation.
Well, it's interesting when he talks about resiliency because one of the main things I study is stress. And so, there's two ways you can think of resiliency. One is what we call stress buffering. So the idea of stress buffering is you just don't get affected when you get exposed to the stressor. So you're essentially better able to have resources that let you essentially not get depressed or anxious or what have you from the stressor. The other way you can think about resiliency is is it a bounce back? That is essentially, yeah, I do get affected by this, and I think a lot of times that's what people think about when they talk about resiliency, is they're thinking, can I bounce back more quickly? Do I not basically essentially fall in a hole of depression or anxiety as much? And do I jump back out more easily? And what we actually find a lot of times is it isn't so much social connections and social capital. They're actually much more important in terms of stress buffering in preventing that initial effect. Because if you have social resources around you, you're better able to deal with a threat when it appears, so you're less detrimentally affected by it from the beginning. And so something that we're looking at now is what you call, of course, social capital. And there's two ways to think about social capital. Is it relational? So is it the friends that I have, the social support that I get, that sort of thing? But also, is it cognitive? Is it the amount of trust that I have in others? Do I feel like this is a community that I am in that I can trust to have my best interests at heart, to not try to harm me? And what we're actually finding, interestingly, is that prior to the pandemic, we look at people prior to the pandemic, look at their level of loneliness. What are their social relationships like? Look at their level of trust, that cognitive aspect of social capital. Both of those seem to be protective of mental health during the pandemic. So even when we take out people's prior levels of anger, of sleep problems, of their distress, and just look at their distress and anger and sleep problems during the pandemic, having these strong social connections, having this social capital really seems to have had a protective effect on people during the pandemic. So even with all these losses that we've seen during the pandemic that I talked about, these losses of confidence, these increasing loneliness, when people had essentially this wealth, this capital of social relationships, they were better able to overall deal with the pandemic, essentially a stress buffering, if you will. And I think that's one of the main ways we could talk about resilience.
Right. I think that's a really great lead into actually a question that we got as well from
Yeah.
she says that there was a CBC article that stated a personality trait of conscientiousness, and that was one of the most helpful traits to best cope in this pandemic. Yeah, would you agree? I'd also love to hear from the other panelists, but Dr. Bierman, thoughts?
Well, I should warn you, I'm a sociologist, so I don't tend to study personality very much. I always tell my students, look, I study what happens in the population. If you want to know, what happens with you, go see a therapist, and then Monica could help you with that. But what we actually find when we talk about personality, what we actually find in sociology is that one of the most important stress buffers, probably the key essential thing that you as an individual can build and maintain to help you deal with stressful situations when they occur, is what we call a sense of mastery, or essentially a sense of control over your life. Do you feel like you control your life and the outcomes of your life? And building this sense that I have efficacy in the world around me is absolutely essential for dealing with stress, because then when we're presented with a stressful situation, it doesn't seem overwhelming. We say we can take control of our lives. This won't have a complete overwhelming effect. But I want to tie this back to when we talk about social isolation and loneliness, because here's the thing. When we have a strong social support network, when we feel like we are immersed in a caring community that will provide resources to us, that enhances our sense of mastery. Essentially, our social relationships form a safety net so that we feel like we can go out and try different approaches to life, especially when stressful circumstances occur, because we feel like we have this safety net to catch us if it doesn't work out and we fall. Like somebody on a high wire. So I think that study of conscientiousness is interesting because it probably relates to mastery, or this sense of control over life. When people have more sense of control over life, when they believe they can accomplish things in life, they're going to be more conscientious. So it's likely that what we find, this sense of control over life, is likely driving that. And that's something I always like to tell people when I talk about my and other sociologists of mental health or research. It's one of the most consistent findings. If we can build supportive social connections, a sense of community of others, this will enhance this critical function, because we always talk about self-esteem. How good do we feel about ourselves, as well as attention? Interestingly, in the literature, it's not so much self-esteem that's as important as is the sense of control over life.
Interesting. Thanks for that. I'm curious, Monica, because when we talk about the communities that you're working with, I'm sure this feeling of this sense of mastery and being immersed in relationship and having a safety net kind of starts to appear when we can't have the social interactions or the ceremonies that we're so accustomed to, and not only Indigenous cultures, but many others. I'm curious as to, what your advice would be around how can we create some of those relationships or create that safety net, knowing that we can't do it in the ways we used to.
I'm a firm believer that necessity is the mother of all invention in many cases. Even when we look at how we're all communicating today, this would have not been the norm a few years ago with respect to our reliance on digital technologies to maintain connection and information sharing. I think moving forward that aspect is definitely key with respect to how students may have to learn more frequently using this modality. Certainly all the therapeutic work I'm doing at this time is virtually. I'm not seeing clients face to face at all at present. Understanding that there are benefits somewhat in the sense that this is more convenient. It feels safer for people sometimes to be beaming in from an environment of their choosing that feels comfortable and safe for them. So there are definite, it's always possible to put a positive frame on things. And in my work with people, I always reiterate that everybody's experience of COVID-19 may be different. Perhaps we haven't experienced a death in our immediate family, or perhaps we haven't become ill ourselves. But there are losses and grief nonetheless around other events, the loss of a job, the loss of feeling that the future is hopeful, in many cases for younger people as well, missing out on important life rituals, having to delay a wedding or not getting to walk and accept your diploma in a convocation ceremony. These are all important events in our lives. They're pivotal shaping events, and many people have not been able to participate in those in a way they would have hoped or in a way they were excited about. But impressing upon people that as a health crisis, I think we can all do our part. Follow the recommendations that have been put out there by people far more educated than I am, for certain, in epidemiology and public health, and these areas where we really need the expertise, and to follow best practices, and accepting that maybe our old normal may not be something we can entirely go back to. And perhaps there are things about our old normal that are okay to leave behind. The hustle and bustle, feeling pulled in different directions. I think for me and many of my colleagues and clients that I work with and staff, this has really caused us to take a step back and examine our priorities. What are our needs versus our wants as individuals, as participants in a busy, hectic culture? So I think there have definitely been some good things that have come out of this trying experience. I do hope, having said that, we're out of it sooner than later. But people need to have a sense of hope that the future we're looking forward to, maybe we'll be more mindful about public health in general, about looking after the weakest members of our societies, because we can only be as strong as those segments of our population are successful. So those are just my thoughts with respect to your question, Monique.
Thanks,
May I ask Monica a question?
Yeah, please. Chime in.
Monica, it's interesting. You were talking about how everybody's experience of this pandemic has been different. Something that's starting to come out in the literature now, and it ties into actually work that was done after the Great Recession, is this idea of anticipatory stressors. This idea that we experience this big national, international event, even if we personally didn't experience an event, it's this sense of, especially if we know people who did, that these negative events could befall us, is in and of itself a stressor on our mental health. Are you finding that people are experiencing this anticipatory stress during the pandemic?
A lot of people are still worried about, if they have a job, keeping that job a month from now, 3 months from now, even further down the road. Interruptions to their studies, to trainings that they needed, to travel. That's been a big one for me. We don't have a longitudinal study in place yet. We haven't been far enough removed from the onset of the pandemic to really have a well-rounded group of data to guide our path forward. I think it's a big question mark. Again, but it's an opportunity. We don't have as much data as we will have from this pandemic that was collected 100 years ago. Obviously, one of the things I've been excited about is that researchers have really focused on starting to collect data immediately, like being very responsive. How can we twist and pivot in a way where we're able to be responsive, to look at trends and alter services or create new ones that we didn't anticipate we might have needed at the beginning of the pandemic. And looking at how different groups have come together and different experts and key informants in the community. That's been the hardest part of my job. I'm so isolated from being able to sit down and talk with elders in the community because some of them are just too much at risk or are not able to leave their homes. And so that knowledge transfer has been affected. And that's something I'm most curious about. If there have been interruptions to that sharing of information and the transfer of knowledge, how are we going to make up for that lost time somewhere down the line?
Thanks for that. I think it's interesting, right? Social isolation, loneliness has been exacerbated as a result of what we're living. And Mateo, though, as a refugee, as someone new to this country, you experienced that not because of a pandemic, but because of the situation. And could you share what you did and what advice you might give to other newcomers? How do they try to get past that view of social isolation and loneliness? And hopefully one day we won't have this pandemic on top of us, like you said, Monica. Hopefully we're coming out of it.
I definitely think that if I can give one advice to newcomers, I would say that the first year is always the hardest. It keeps getting easier and easier after the first year. And I would say don't give up and don't let anyone tell you what you can or can't do based on where you're from or your past experiences. This is a country of opportunity. Even after COVID-19, I'm getting opportunities such as this one today, right? This is a country of opportunity, a country that rewards hard work. If you work hard and put in the work, you will achieve your goals. And I would say that this country gives opportunities regardless of your ideologies, your religion, your ethnicity, where you come from. It doesn't matter. If you put in the work, you will get to where you want to go. And history has shown again and again what immigrants and refugees can and have achieved in this country and will continue to do so in the future. I know that social isolation is really, really hard even before COVID. When you're completely new in a new country and you don't know anyone and you don't even speak the language, it can be very stressful and it can take a very heavy toll on your mental health and even your physical health. But it gets easier, whether it's before COVID or after COVID. It's hard either way, but it gets easier and easier with time. So if I can give any advice, just don't give up and keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Mateo. I think it'd be great to, we have a few questions, and a couple of the questions are focused on social capital. So I'll see if I can combine them both. Alex, jump in, but please, Monica and Mateo, as you see things. So does social capital get spent over time? For instance, how we will run out of social capital if the COVID pandemic persists for a long time. And when COVID is over, how do we rebuild social capital? And so how effective can it be to sustain us through isolation?
That's a wonderful question. That is a absolutely great question, because it's one of the primary questions that sociologists, when they've studied people over time, especially as people have aged, it's one of the questions that they've asked, which is essentially when you hit a life course risk, some sort of danger point, do you essentially spend out your capital, or is it essentially a resource that maintains itself? And what we by and large seem to see is that even when you rely on social capital, you don't necessarily lose it. With one important proviso, at least in Western culture, there's one of the most consistent rules of social relationships is this: the rule of reciprocity. So essentially, if you do me a favor, I am going to feel honor bound to return that favor at some point down the line. So if you end up depending, especially on your social aspects of social capital, not so much the cognitive aspects, but the social aspects, and if you depend on these social relationships, and then down the line, you aren't there for people when they need you, that's what's really going to harm your social capital. So there needs to essentially be some sense of reciprocity. And this is where really actually economic status is really often come into play. We find that people who are experiencing economic deprivation often have lower levels of this social capital. And one of the main reasons why is people are prevented from engaging in norms of reciprocity. They just don't have the economic or other ancillary resources to let them maintain social relationships. So just in terms of using your social relationships as a basis when you experience threats, be it the COVID-19 or other threats, that in and of itself does not actually deplete your social relationships. It's these additional factors that really may come into play.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Monica or Mateo if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
For me, the idea of, I love the idea of reciprocity. It's a life philosophy for me personally, professionally as well. But this idea of being open to gaining wisdom and knowledge from everybody, not just those of us who might have some letters behind our name. There is just so much to learn from engaging with everybody around us. This for me is very true with young people. When I'm working with young people who've had very adverse life experiences, I'm always shocked how unwilling systems are to hear their voices or to reach out to them as key informants, whether it's with respect to addiction, maltreatment of children, academic struggles, et cetera, et cetera. So this idea of everybody has something to teach each of us, and being open to that, and creating a space where people from all walks of life can feel heard and contribute whatever they feel is helpful to a conversation. I just think that's so important, especially now.
So I think there's a really interesting topic. You know, scholars across North America and certainly in Western nations have been saying we're experiencing a loneliness epidemic. We're surrounded by technology and people, but yet we are in this loneliness epidemic. And I'm curious, maybe Alex, if you could speak to what the implications of that might be, and your thoughts on whether or not you think we're in a loneliness epidemic, and what the residual effects of that might be.
You know, it's interesting you asked that, because I and my co-authors just actually got a conditional acceptance on a paper where we're examining that in a little bit of different way. So what we did was we took our survey of Canadians. It was actually a survey of working Canadians from 2019. And what we did was we looked at whether gig workers, Uber drivers, Skip delivery people, such of that nature, do they report being more lonely? And they do. And so you would think that, well, you have more control over your life, you're better able to structure your life. But I think what happens is basically this: all of this technology that we have, I think what it does is it creates fleeting interactions that we can never really, or not, I shouldn't say never, but we have less tendencies to just sit down with people, look someone in the eye, and obviously we can't do this during the pandemic, and really feel like we have a meaningful interaction with someone. I don't know about you, I hate texting. I hate texting with a passion, because there's always a question of nuance. Things are always abbreviated, and now people look at me in horror. I say, well, just phone me. You want me to phone you to talk to you on a telephone? My goodness. And I think, and even that, they're still not looking somebody in the eye, or not sitting down with them. And I think if we really want to talk about, well, what do we need to do? I think technology can be useful. I mean, I've managed to maintain relationships with my colleagues literally all over the world, thanks to Zoom during the pandemic. But I think it's also, you know, this is an overused word these days, but I think it's really useful in this context. Be mindful about our social relationships, and don't just simply invest in them. Don't simply try to have them, but mindfully attend to them. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, I have a million social relationships. It's when I have a social contact with someone, am I trying to have that contact rather than, okay, I saw them while I was on my phone. I texted them for 30 seconds last Thursday, not something like that. Try just to have a meaningful interaction, even with just one person. And that can, I think, be as beneficial as 30 different text messages with 30 different people.
Awesome. Definitely says we need to take that mindfulness. I remember going out for dinner with friends and everyone would have their phones on the table, and that was standard. We accepted that. But I think that we may have come to a point where when we do get the opportunity to be back together, whatever that might look like, that we may be more aware of our interactions and putting our phones aside. And Mateo, having a student, someone that's been going through so much, I mean, have you noticed behavior change between yourself, your other student population? And do you see what might occur once we've come out of this pandemic in behaviors and interactions? Oh, I'm not sure if he heard me. Oh, possibly not. Monica, do you want to jump into that? Maybe it's more in the context of even your workplace environment and dealing with some of your clients.
One group that have really had a tough time in the last year are parents. So it doesn't seem to matter if they're parents of young children. I am so grateful right now to be the mother of older children. I can't even imagine trying to do my job at home, from home, trying to give out goldfish crackers, stay on top of potty training, all of these things. It's really made me realize as a culture how we forget how important our community is to helping us raise our children. The kids can't go to team sports and learn from coaches or continue on in some cases with music lessons or volunteering opportunities. So this arsenal of other adults who we're accustomed to relying on to help shape and transform our children into hopefully good civic-minded people. All of that is missing for parents, and kids are isolated, kids and teens, from peers, and social referencing is so important at all ages, but especially with young adults and people who are really trying to cement the beginnings of a set identity for themselves in adolescence. And so we're all looking around, trying to do the best we can without these ancillary supports and the feedback that we need from other people. Am I doing okay? Am I handling this okay? So that's been such a challenge for everybody to deal with, parents, kids of all ages. So kudos to everyone who's just hanging in there. It really has been tough for all of us.
So I'm curious, because our topic is really social isolation and impact on youth, but it's impact on all of us. And we don't want to think that this will happen again. But, if it were to happen again, what tips can we give to parents, to natural supports around how do we better prepare so that we don't feel as isolated? Is there something we can do? I know, Alex, we've talked about social capital, but Monica, I'm curious as well if there's things you would be saying to the parents that you're dealing with, how to prepare for that.
Don't wait for the perfect time to say or do anything that is even remotely important to you as a parent. Stay connected with your children. My kids are older and kind of doing their own thing now, and I'm so proud of the adults they're becoming. But I still try to text with them. I try not to bug them too much. I'm leaving space for them to be a little bit more independent now. But hopefully they always feel like mom has their back, even though I don't see them anymore or live with them in the same way we all used to be together under one roof. Maintaining that sense of I'm holding space for you in my life, and I always will, and I'm never too busy to be available for whatever it is you need, and offering those same privileges or benefits to our friends, to our colleagues, to our extended family members. Just being willing to be present for other people, and hopefully that's a benefit to ourselves as well.
Great. We have a question, and it also leads back to what youth and children are experiencing, and it's from Rick, and it's this, the concept of on again, off again classroom, right? Virtual. We know now, again, starting next week, I think kids are back in class. And so, what impact is that having on our youth with respect to social capital and social loneliness? And are youth more or less resilient? And Alex, maybe you could jump in here and give us some thoughts, and then I'd like to open it to the rest of the panel.
Well, most of my research really hasn't focused on youth specifically. We know in general, if you experience adversity, oftentimes this can build coping resources. But I think for me, at least, I do know some other people at the university who are looking at youth in the Calgary school system specifically. But I'm not right now aware of questions or research on loneliness specifically among youth, unfortunately.
Okay. Monica or Mateo, I'm not sure if you have anything you can contribute or add.
I can jump in on this one a little bit. Last year, I actually did a study at the University of Calgary, a qualitative study about how has the transition to online learning affect students at the university. And so we did these interviews with about 30 students at the University of Calgary, and most of them actually reported a lot more negative impacts than positive ones when it came to their social well-being, their motivation to do homework in school. This was one of the biggest factors that we found, is that they lost motivation to do homework because they weren't interacting with other students on campus. They weren't going to lectures and interacting with professors. They found it a lot harder to get up every day and get back on schedule. But there were also a couple of positive results as well that I think are also worth exploring. The biggest ones were that students have been finding a lot of different and new ways to actually record their notes, and new ways to study and new ways to organize their lives. I know, like, one of the students was mentioning that they found this transcription app that will record and transcribe lectures right away, right when the professor was talking. And all these students gave us such like different technological websites and apps and new skills that they're doing, and I thought that was great. I mean, it's just, I love seeing initiatives like that. And I think, students who are focusing more on, how I can make the most of this, were the students who actually also experienced way less negative impacts on their social and psychological well-being.
Great. I think there's so much we can learn, and hopefully there's certain things that we are learning that will stay with us. And with all this knowledge and what we've heard today around, the aspects of all of not only the pandemic, but the effects of socially distanced behaviors, what it does around isolation, social isolation and loneliness. I'm curious, Alex, what advice you'd give to governments or organizations around how to prepare society for the impact of social isolation.
I think there's a couple of different things. I think it really ties into what Monica is talking about, is that we have to really protect the most vulnerable in society. And look, I can sit here and be on my nice fancy laptop and Zoom with you, but not everybody has that option. I think that's really, when we talk about governments, where should they be focusing? I think we definitely have to pay attention to the entire Canadian population, certainly. But I think we also have to be focusing on people who are most vulnerable. Some of my other research that I think I mentioned to you at some point, what we found was that when we looked at economic hardships during the pandemic, it was economic hardship prior to the pandemic, which was one of the strongest, if not the strongest, predictor of hardship experienced during the pandemic. Essentially, this pandemic has really worked to reify inequality and reinforce inequality in Canada. So something that I am very concerned about is taking care of the most vulnerable, because what we found was two other really big factors that increase people's risk of economic hardship was psychological distress and poor health prior to the pandemic. So it really was people who were in vulnerable situations prior to the pandemic economically seem to have been falling through the cracks. And I think that really relates to loneliness, because when you fall through the cracks economically, you really feel divorced from society overall. We live in a capitalist society. And so what I'd really like to see is much more attention in the government among the people who have really experienced a lot of economic issues during the pandemic.
I think that's a great note to end on. And really this sense of equality. I want to thank Alex, Monica, and Mateo for joining us today. And I also want to thank our viewers. Social isolation is a growing concern in our community, and it's really up to us in our role as natural supports to build the skills needed so we can support each other. I'm excited to say that the Social Impact Lab launched the newest version of our Natural Supports YYC online simulation. And it's a platform that teaches and engages adults in exploring the role of a natural support so we can be prepared to support the children and youth in our lives. And in fact, our peers and our friends that might be dealing with social isolation. Our newest story includes or follows a new immigrant experiencing social isolation, which Mateo has helped us with. So learn firsthand through our new simulated stories the competencies that you need in order to support a child or youth that could be experiencing any of the concerns we've raised today. Dr. Bierman around anxiety, depression, sadness, and of course, social isolation. You can see the URL is listed here. If you'd like to continue engaging with us, you can follow us on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us on this really important topic of social isolation. We've recorded the episode. You will get a link through your email, and it'll also be available on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to join us. Sign up for our next episode on June 16th, which is all about social entrepreneurs in the making. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and be safe and stay healthy.
Bye.